LETTER the 39th of Life in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life in Mexico by Francis Calderon de la Barca. Letter the 39th. Holy Thursday at Coyohuacan. Hernán Cortés. His last wishes. Padres Camilos. Old Church. Procession. Representation of the Taking of Christ. Curate's sermon under the trees. A religious drama. Good Friday. Portable pulpit. Heat. Booths. Religious procession. Simon the Cyrenian. Costumes. Curate's sermon. Second discourse. Sentence pronounced by Pontius Pilate. Descent from the cross. Procession of the angels. Funeral hymn. The Pésame to the Virgin. Sermon. Sweet Kitty Clover. Music in Mexico. Anecdote. On Holy Thursday we went early in the morning to Coyohuacan, now pronounced Cuyacan, which is almost a continuation of the village of San Angel, but there are more trees in it, and every house has its garden, or at least its inner court, filled with orange trees. Here, after the total destruction of the ancient Tenochtitlan, Cortés took up his residence for several months. Here he founded a convent of nuns, and in his testament he desired to be buried in this convent, in whatever part of the world I may finish my days. The conqueror's last wishes in this respect were not held sacred. At the time of the conquest, Coyohuacan, together with Tacubaya, etc., stood upon the margin of the lake of Tezcuco, most of the houses built within the water upon stakes, so that the canoes entered by a low door. This was undoubtedly the favourite retreat of Cortés, and it is now one of the prettiest villages near Mexico. Its church is wonderfully handsome, one of the finest village churches we have yet seen. One of the prettiest places in the village belongs to an order of monks called the Padres Camilos. It consists of a house and garden, where the monks go by turns to enjoy the country air. Comfortable padres! There is one room looking into the garden, and opening into a walk bordered by rose bushes, which is such a place for a siesta, cool, retired, fragrant. A hammock with a mattress on it is slung across the room, and here the good padre may lie, with one eye open to the roses, and the other closed in inward meditation. However, its whole merit consists in being cleanly and neatly kept, for it is a large empty house, and the garden, so called, is little more than a pasture field, with nice gravel walks cut through it, bordered with fine rose bushes, and beautified by a clear fountain. We went to the A.'s house, which is halfway between San Angel and Coyohuacan, the Señora A. driving me herself in an open carratea with white frisones, northern horses, which, compared with the spirited little Mexican steeds, look gigantic. We went first to see the church, which was brilliantly illuminated and ornamented with loads of flowers and fruit, especially oranges, and thronged with ragged léperos and blanketed Indians. We then set off to endeavour, if possible, to find a place in the crowd who had hurried off to see el prendimiento, the taking of Christ, and to hear the curate preach an appropriate sermon in a portable pulpit amongst the trees. We made our way through the patient, bronzed, and blanketed crowd, not without sundry misgivings as to the effects of evil communication, and at length reached the procession, all ranged on the grass under the trees, in a pretty and secluded little grove, in two long rows fronting each other, each person carrying a lamp surmounted by a plume of coloured feathers, very ingeniously made of coloured spun glass. They were all dressed in the costume of Pharisees, Jews, Romans, etc. The image of the Saviour was shortly after carried through on a platform to the sound of music, followed by the 11 disciples, and was placed in a kind of bower amongst the trees, supposed to give a representation of the Garden of Gethsemane. A portable pulpit covered with shining stuff was carried in and placed beneath a tree just outside of this enclosure, and soon after the curate arrived and mounted into his place. A number of little ragged boys, who had climbed up on the very topmost branches of the trees to have a good view, were piked down with lances by the Jews, notwithstanding their seemingly just remonstrances that they were doing no harm. But when the Jews observed in answer to their "¿Qué hacemos?" (what are we doing?) "The Señor Cura will be angry," they tumbled down one on the top of the other like ripe apples, and then stood watching for the first convenient opportunity of slipping up again. The curate began his sermon by an account of the sufferings and persecution of Christ, of the causes and effects of his death, of the sinfulness of the Jews, etc. He talked for about half an hour, and his sermon was simple enough and adapted to his audience. He described the agony of Christ when in the garden, to which he often resorted with his disciples, and the treachery of Judas, who knew the place, and who, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. As he went on describing the circumstances minutely, one who represented the spy, with a horrible mask like a pig's face, was seen looking through the trees, where the Saviour was concealed, and shortly after, Judas, his face covered with a black crape, and followed by a band of soldiers, glided through stealthily. "Now," said the curate, "observe what the traitor does. He hath given them a sign, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, hold him fast.' He goes, he approaches the sacred person of the Lord. Here Judas went forward and embraced the Saviour. 'It is done!' cried the preacher. 'The horrible act of treachery is completed.' And forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. But now Jesus, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. As the curate said these words, they all fell prostrate on the ground. 'Mark,' cried he, 'the power of the word. They came out to take him with swords and with staves, but at the sound of the divine word they acknowledge the power of God and fall at his feet. But it is only for a moment. Behold, now they bind him, they buffet him, they smite him with the palms of their hands, they lead him away to the high priest.'" All this was enacted in succession, though sometimes the curate was obliged to repeat the same thing several times before they recollected what to do. And already, in anticipation of the iniquitous sentence, behold what is written. This alluded to a paper fastened upon a pole, which a man held above the heads of the crowd, and on which was written, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, condemned to death by Pontius Pilate, President of Upper Galilee. And now, escorted by Judas and the multitude, the Saviour was borne through the crowd in conclusion of the prendimiento. The curate wound up his discourse by an exhortation to abstain from sin, which had been the cause of this awful event. I regret to state that at this very moment a man poked his hand into A's pocket, who turned very sharply round and asked him what he wanted. "Nada, señorito." "Nothing, sir," said he, with an innocent smile, showing 2 rows of teeth, like an ivory railing, but at the same time disappearing pretty swiftly amongst the crowd, who now all began to move and to follow the procession, the band striking up a galope. In the evening we returned to San Angel and visited the lighted churches there. As it was late when we entered the parroquia (parish church), the lights were nearly all extinguished, and a few alone of the devout were still kneeling before a figure of our Saviour in chains. On Good Friday we set off early for Coyohuacan, though rather afraid of the sun, which at present, in the middle of the day, is insupportable, and even by 10 o'clock disagreeable. The whole enclosure round the church, and to a great distance beyond it, was covered with people, and there were even a few carriages full of well-dressed persons, who had come from the different neighbouring haciendas, amongst others the family of the Marquesa de Vivanco. The Padre Yturralde, who has some reputation for eloquence, was expected to preach 3 sermons at Coyohuacan that day, besides one in the village of Mizcuaque. We found that one sermon was just concluded. By the time we arrived the sun was pouring down his beams like molten lead. Our carriage was open and under every tree was a crowd.